One summer night, during a severe thunderstorm, there was a mother who was tucking her small son into a bed. And she was about to turn the light off when he asked her in a trembling voice, he said, "Mommy, will you stay with me all night?" Smiling, the mother gave him a warm, reassuring hug, and she said tenderly, I can't, dear. I have to sleep in Daddy's room." There was a long silence, and that was broken by a shaky voice that said, "Big sissy." Today is the final sermon in a series about the nation of Israel traveling into and then back out of the country of Egypt in slavery. This is the kind of epic finale to everything that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. And if you think back to the beginning of the story, back to Joseph and his brothers selling him into slavery in Egypt 430 years before our story today, this really is just one big narrative of people going through an incredibly difficult time and God sticking with them through every trial. Now, personally, I've never dealt with slavery in my life, but the core message of God sticking with us through every struggle, that was a truth I needed to hear, and I think you guys might need to hear it this morning as well. So let's dive in. First, we have to center ourselves in the story a little bit, right? The nation of Israel is finally leaving Egypt. God has performed the 10 plagues. Pharaoh said, okay, get out. God's, told them all about the rituals and traditions that they're going to do to remember the story for generations. And then last week, we saw that God took them off the main road, right? And along the path of the wilderness. Chapter 14 opens up, and God has plopped the Israelites down right outside of a place called Migdol. And they set up camp right next to the Red Sea. And then in verse 5, it says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about the people and said, "What have we done? We released Israel from serving us." Now, this happened with almost every single plague. Every single time something bad would happen, and Pharaoh would say, okay, I'll let you people go. And then as soon as the plague goes away, he changes his mind and says, no, you have to stay. But this time, it's too late. Israel is gone. They gathered up all their stuff. They left really quickly. They left in a hurry, and they got out of Dodge. So now that they are gone, Pharaoh and his buddies look around, and they're like, well, now, wait a minute. Does this mean we have to clean up after ourselves? We just let all the servants go away. This is a terrible idea. What do you mean they're gone? We released them from serving us. This is a terrible idea. Why did we do that? Let's go get them back. And so Pharaoh gathers up his chariots and his soldiers, and they all rush out to catch up with the Israelites in verse 9. And it says, all the Egyptians and all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his horsemen and his army, chased after them. And they caught up with them as they camped by the sea beside, I don't know how to say it, Pahahiroth, in front of the Baal Zephon. But as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians coming after them. And the Israelites were terrified, and they cried out to Moses. They cried out to the Lord for help. So Pharaoh catches up to the Israelites exactly where God said they would be, and Israelites lose their mind. They are terrified, and they immediately start crying out to God, and they start whining to Moses. In verse 11, it says, they said to Moses, "It is because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness. What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Okay, now there's something really key that I want you guys to catch with this. On the one hand, I think Israel has a totally legitimate reason to be afraid. Right? Pharaoh and the Egyptians have basically represented death and oppression and all sorts of terrible things. It totally makes sense that they would be terrified. Those guys were in control for generations. For hundreds of years, Pharaoh has been in control. But on the other hand, Israel gets so scared that they wish that they could go back to slavery. They say, what? Were there not enough holes in the ground for Egypt, for us to have graves in Egypt? You brought us here to die. We knew we never should have listened to you. We should have stayed happy in our slavery. They literally said those words out of their face with a straight face at Moses. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians. Now here's the thing. When I read that, I am tempted to make fun of the Israelites. Because they're being stupid, right? I mean, obviously, God has done such incredible things. He has brought them out of slavery. They're headed towards freedom, and they get a little scared, and they want to run back to slavery. And I think the biggest emotion that I have when I read that is scorn. Like, I look down on the Israelites. I'm like, you want to what? You want to go back to slavery? You want to go back to oppression? That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. But then I think about how all of us kind of do that in our own lives, right? If you've ever talked to a woman who is in an abusive relationship, and you ask, why didn't you leave sooner? Why didn't you run? Why didn't you go? And because sometimes the devil is not as scary as an unknown future, right? You want to run away, but then where are your children going to sleep? You want to run away, but where's the next meal going to come from? So for us to trust in God, to take that leap of faith, so many of us look at the trust that's required, and we start to tell ourselves, well, maybe my slavery is not so bad. See, I think the sin in our lives can be an abuser. And when we look at our lives and we think, oh man, I don't want this anymore. I don't want this sin in my life. I need to stop. I need to get this thing out of my life. But then we calculate, what's it going to take to make a change in our life? What's it going to take to live my life the way I'm supposed to? And suddenly it becomes easier to rationalize and make ourselves feel better about our slavery than it is to trust God. E. Stanley Jones says, I am inwardly fashioned for faith, not for fear. Fear is not my native land. Faith is. I was made so that worry and anxiety, it's like sand in the machinery of my life, where faith is the oil. I live better by faith and confidence than I do by fear and doubt and anxiety. In anxiety and worry, my being is gasping for breath. That's not my native air. But faith and confidence, then I can breathe freely. That's my native air. A Johns Hopkins University doctor will say, we do not know why it is that worriers die sooner than non-worriers, but it is a fact. But I, E. Stanley Jones said this, but I, who am simple of mind, I think I know. We are inwardly constructed in nerve and tissue, brain cell and soul for faith and not for fear. God made us that way. To live by worry is to live against reality. Now, there's two key themes I want you to pick up on today, okay? You're going to see it stamped all over the story. Number one, the danger is real. Israel had good reasons to be afraid. It was close, it was threatening, it was bearing down on them, and it was real. It totally makes sense that they would panic and keep reaching back to the old familiar slavery. Pharaoh is coming, they're trapped up against the Red Sea, the chariots are pressing down on them, the danger is real. And that applies to our lives too. There's a lot of danger in our world. The danger is real. And the second piece, and you're going to see this for the rest of the story, is that you are never safer than when you are in God's arms. You are never safer than when you are in God's arms. Israel is terrified. But Moses tells them in verse 13, he says, but Moses said to the people, don't be afraid. Stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, but you must be quiet. Okay, so God's about to do some like awesome action hero type stuff. But I love that Moses had to get this one little note in there. It says, the Lord will fight for you, but you must be quiet. This is actually the beginning of a grand tradition of Moses telling the Israelites to shut up. Right? Just quit your worrying. Quit your worrying, right? Like Moses is looking around, he's like, guys, we are the nation of Israel. We got like 6 of the main characters of the first 5 books of the Old Testament right here. We're going to be okay, right? The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet. And then the big scene begins. God tells the Israelites, okay, break camp. And Moses, I want you to lift your staff up and stretch your hand out over the Red Sea. The waters divide, and Israelites begin to travel across the sea on the dry ground. And then it says in verse 19, then the angel of God, who was going out in front of the Israelites, he moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. It came between the Egyptian and Israelite forces. There was cloud and darkness, and it lit up the night, and neither group came near each other all night long. So the angel of the Lord, this like pillar of fire, pillar of cloud, moves to the rear guard to protect them. He blocks Pharaoh, gives them time to get across the dry ground. Verse 21, then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and on their left. So 2 quick things. First, fun fact. Did you know that this passage is where our district gets its name? This United Methodist Church is part of a district of churches, and we are called the East Winds District. And I never understood that. I was like, what is the east winds? The powerful east wind that divided the Red Sea. The other thing I want you to do is I want you to imagine walking through the Red Sea. I mean, it's crazy that they were walking on dry ground at all, but it literally describes a wall of water on each side. Like you could reach out and touch the water on the left and on the right. It's like a tunnel held up by nothing except some wind and the power of God. I remember a couple months ago, I took my kids to the Detroit Zoo. And a while back, we went to the polar bear exhibit. Have you guys ever been to Detroit Zoo? The polar bear exhibit, right? And they have this tunnel, like underneath, that like goes through the waters. Anybody ever been to this? It's so cool. It's so much fun. And it's really cool because if you're lucky, there might be a polar bear that like swims over your head while you're walking in the tunnel. And I remember the last time we went, the older 2 boys, they had been there before. So they were pumped. They were like, this is really cool. But Ezra, kid number 3, he was very leery. He's like, whoa, no, wait a minute. Like, we go down the stairs and we're inside, and that's cool. I'm looking at the penguins through the glass. That's fine. You want me to go into that hallway? There's, like, nothing above us. There's water. That's a bear. He was not sold. He just kind of stood in the entranceway and just kind of peeked into the tunnel like, no, I don't think so. I'm not going in there. I actually had to carry him through the polar bear tunnel because he was so terrifying, all that sunlight and water and bears floating over your head. I can't imagine how incredible and scary and awesome and frightening the whole process must have been for the Israelites to walk through the dry ground. Then the Egyptians set off in pursuit. Pharaoh's horses and chariots and everybody followed the Israelites into the Red Sea. It says in verse 25, during the morning watch, the Lord looked down at the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw the Egyptian forces into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. Let's get away from Israel, the Egyptians said, because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. The danger was real. The chariots were coming, the wall holding back the power of the water on the right and the left side. The danger was real, but Israel was never safer. Right? God fought for them. And it finishes up, the chapter closes with these verses. It says, but the Israelites had walked through the sea on dry ground, with waters like a wall on their right and on their left. And that day, the Lord saved Israel from the power of the Egyptians, and the Israelites saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. And when Israel saw the great power of the Lord used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and believed in him and his servant Moses. So what I want you to see is that this whole story, all of this, was God's action. God guided them. He protected them. He literally fought for them. Their wheels were going crazy. The danger was real. It was close and threatening and terrifying, but they were never safer than when they were in God's hands. And the same is true in our lives. See, the good news is just screaming at me off the page this morning is that God will lead you through your troubles. God does not lead you around your troubles. He doesn't lead you over your troubles or away from it. He will lead you through it. There's an old quote. Nobody knows who said it, but it's brilliant. And it says, sometimes the Lord will calm the storm. And sometimes he lets the storm rage, but he calms his child. I can't promise you that you're never going to have troubles. I can't promise you it's all going to be sunny days and mountaintops. In fact, I'm actually going to promise you life is the opposite. There are going to be days when the storm will rage and God does not turn it off. Sometimes you will walk in the valley of the shadow of death. Sometimes you will be totally overwhelmed and it will feel like all your troubles, the sin of your life is like a wall of water on the left and on the right, terrifying and pressing in on you. That's real. And anybody trying to tell you differently is trying to sell you a false Christianity. But what I can promise you is that God will lead you through it. You might get wet, but God will lead you through your Red Sea. He may not calm the storm, but he will calm his beloved child, you. And there's two things I want to do with this truth today, two challenges that I have for you and how this applies to your life. First, you've got to leave it in God's hands, right? In this life, when we grab for control, our fears only end up getting amplified. When you grab for control, our fears are amplified. I think about, this is something that God has been teaching me personally in my life a lot. I think about the future. There's a lot of unknowns, and it makes me want to grab for control. I got to have control of my life. But if we want to have faith instead of fear, it starts with trusting God, with putting it in his hands. Leave it in God's hands. It doesn't mean you're not scared, right? You can still be scared and have faith. I think about all the people grieving on All Saints' Day. You can be scared. The fact that the future is going to be different because people are missing. You can be scared and still have faith. I know the Israelites were scared when they were walking through the Red Sea. There's no part of that story that was like, and the Israelites were totally confident and they felt great about everything and they confidently walked across the Red Sea. No, it said they were terrified. They were horrified. They were running away in abject fear. But they knew that this direction was where God was wanting them to go. I know the Israelites were scared when they walked through the Red Sea. There's a story about a World War II general named General George Patton. And he was like this really high-ranking general. And one day he met a military governor, real high-ranking officer. And the governor was praising him. He was like, "You are amazing. You're such a brave, heroic man. You've led us to victory in World War II. And so General Patton turned to him and he said, "Sir, I am not a brave man. The truth is that I am an utter craven coward. I have never been within the sound of a gunshot or in the sight of a battle in my whole life that I wasn't so scared that I had sweat on my palms." He said, he wrote this in his book, his autobiography. He said, "I just learned very early on in my life never to take counsel in my fears." Having fears doesn't mean you can't have faith. The phrase is not faith instead of fears, is it? What's the phrase? Faith over our fears. We all have moments when we are scared. We're walking through the tunnel with the walls of water on the right and on the left, and the danger is real. I'm not diminishing it, right? But if you leave it in God's hands, you have never been safer than when you are in God's arms. So my first challenge is leave it in God's hands. My second challenge is that you've got to walk through the water. Trusting in God's power, trusting in his sovereignty, it doesn't mean he's going to carry you and make it super easy, right? Trusting in God. God fights for us. But Israel had to walk across the dry land. There is still agency. There is still free will and responsibility. You have to do your part in the faith journey. God's got this, but you need to walk through the waters on the dry ground. Trust God. Leave it in his hands, and then take that first step forward. The story of Israel into Egypt and back out again is not a story of smooth transitions or an ever-improving climb upwards. And you might ask, well, what if I take that step forward? What if I trust God and I take that step forward and things get worse? What if I take that step and I wind up feeling even more lost? Well, you're in really good company, because that's exactly what happened to Joseph. He got tossed down a well, and he trusted God, and so then he got sold into slavery. And he trusted God, so then he ended up in prison. He trusted God, and eventually God took him where he was needed to be. But every time he trusted God and took that next step forward. The nation of Israel did the exact same thing. Moses shows up, and everything gets worse for Israel. Suddenly they got to make bricks without straw. But they trusted God, and then suddenly we got plagues raining down all around them, but they trusted God, and then suddenly they're penned up against the Red Sea. They just had to keep taking that next step forward. There's a lot of bad moments in the story, and I think in all of our lives there are a lot of bad moments. There's going to be times in your life where you feel like Pharaoh's chariots are coming behind you and you got walls of water on the left and on the right, and in that moment, I want to leave you with this. In that moment, all you have to do, all you can do, is leave it in God's hands and take that next step forward onto the dry ground. Amen.